My name is Bronislaw Szerszinski and I'm a sociologist based at Lancaster University. Although my origin, when I first came to the university, my roots were much more in the humanities disciplines, in history, philosophy and religious studies, but then I moved to sociology later and I now specialise in environment and technology issues. So we're in the Institute for Human Paleontology in Paris, and the reason for that is because we're just coming to the end now of a day-and-a-half conference called Thinking the Anthropocene, which has brought together natural scientists, social scientists, humanities scholars together to discuss the concept of the Anthropocene. So on the Anthropocene, my position, I suppose, is still evolving. I think it's still developing as a term as it spreads across different kinds of disciplines and different ways of knowing. I think there are more kind of wrinkles coming out as people are developing critical discourses around it from different points of view. I suppose I'm attracted to it and like working with the concept because I find it So I think the Anthropocene is a really good concept for the social sciences and humanities to engage with. And we have to do it critically. We have to be aware of all the scientific presuppositions that lie behind the term. And we also have to be aware of earlier attempts to kind of bring together the understanding of society and culture on the one hand and the understanding of nature on the other hand and the politics of that. And we don't want to stumble into some of the kind of problems that that kind of fusion has had in the past, reductionism of various sorts. I think in some ways the Anthropocene is useful for dealing with some unfinished business, if you like. I think certainly in the environmental humanities and the environmental social sciences, I think the greening, if you like, of these disciplines has been very limited. I think in all of these areas, in eco-linguistics, in environmental sociology, eco-criticism, environmental philosophy, etc., there is small groups of scholars who have taken very seriously the need to re-embed our understanding of the social and cultural within the ecological context, but the wider disciplines haven't really been transformed. And I think in some sense the Anthropocene gives us another chance to actually try to effect a more major transformation in the way that the social sciences and humanities deal with nature. So I think that's one thing, and certainly it's I find a sort of delicious irony that the geology, which is in some ways one of the least charismatic disciplines, and it's a discipline which has in some ways been overtaken by the wider kind of framing of earth sciences and earth system science and so on, but nevertheless geology, it's out of geology that is coming this latest attempt to overcome the divide between nature and culture, not out of French philosophy or science studies or whatever. So I think there's a nice irony there which I like to play with. So I think the term is very generative. It's problematic in ways that people are starting to unpack in interesting ways. But it's also, I think, a real opportunity for us to do a kind of rethinking of lots of our categories about the way that human societies and culture exist on the planet. So the Anthropocene, in its sort of standard account, is a way of saying that the Earth, the state of the Earth, the system of the Earth is shifting into a new stage. So this is coming out of the earth sciences and geology, the idea that that we are no longer in the period of stable climate that's lasted about 10,000 years of human agriculture and civilization, but that we're moving into a new epoch in which human beings are the major geological force. So that's the basic idea of the Anthropocene. And geologically speaking, what is important is what traces we will leave behind us in the rocks. Geological periods are named very much on the basis of whether you can see a change in the rocks. If you can't, then it's not an age kind of thing. And so, but as the Anthropocene is going out of a pure geological framing, I think there are other ways of thinking about what the Anthropocene names. And I suppose I'm less I do think the idea of when the Anthropocene starts is an interesting question. As we've heard today in the conference, people are pointing out there are political implications about whether we date it 10,000 years ago or 1800 or 1950 or whatever. But I think there are other ways of thinking about the periodization of the Anthropocene. I mean, one issue is its status, as whether it should be seen, if we're talking in geological terms, merely as an epoch or as something larger, a period or an era, some of these much more major changes in the Earth system. And that's what I was exploring in my paper today, the idea that other people have raised this possibility as well, that actually the kind of changes that we are initiating, or that humans and their technologies are initiating on the planet, are actually potentially of huge significance for the whole way that the planet organizes itself, its whole kind of mode of becoming, its mode of change, and particularly the use of technology, I think, is a radical shift in the way that the Earth operates. So I think it's not just when the Anthropocene starts, it's also like when it ends, and what kind of level of importance is this change. But I think there's also other ways of thinking about the Anthropocene which get away from the idea, the sort of linear idea that there are ages that follow one after another, one stops, another one starts. And again, I was exploring this today in my paper, that the idea that what happens in the Anthropocene is that the different ages of the Earth start to touch each other and affect each other. So times that we think are over, that are finished millions and millions of years ago, like the Carboniferous era when the coal was laid down, or the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods when the oil and gas was laid down, that we mine and pipe and burn today, that those eras and those periods are somehow becoming reanimated, you know, that what we're doing to the planet is not just about our own agency. And my colleague Catherine Yusof talks about the way we borrow our agency from these earlier strata in the Earth. So I think the Anthropocene is also, I think, challenges the idea of geological stability, because we are the creature who is doing the most, if you like, as an organism, arguably, I think it's true, to delayer the Earth, to destratify it, to overturn the layers, and in that sense is kind of reanimating these ages which we thought were past. So I think there are ways in which the Anthropocene, well, there's at least two ways in which the Anthropocene messes with the notion of time. One is something that other writers like Dipesh Chakrabarty have talked about, the way that planetary time and human history sort of come together in a new way, but also that it challenges a lot of the ways we think about the times of the Earth and whether they are past times or whether these past times can somehow come back and represent themselves. I think that's very interesting and crucial to understand.
Thank you.
So in terms of the anthropos bit of the Anthropocene, you know, the fact that this is an epoch which is named after a certain denomination representing the human being, I think is very interesting. Obviously, it's crucial to the notion of the Anthropocene that it's about drawing attention to the effect that human civilization, human activity, human economy, human technology is having on planetary systems, and how it's becoming more consequent on planetary systems than the natural systems, as it were, in the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, use of water, use of the solar energy falling on the landscape, use of biomass, and so on and so forth. That's really important. I mean, obviously, any representation of the human is political. I mean, I don't know if people remember the Pioneer plaques, so the Pioneer spaceships that were sent out past Jupiter and Saturn, and are now leaving the solar system, and NASA put these cultural artifacts on the spacecraft, thinking that maybe one day they will be seen by aliens. And so what do you do? You know, what do you send? You know, what music do you send out? Would it be Beethoven or rock and roll or some African music or whatever? And also there were these pictures, on the plaque on the side of the spaceship had a man and a woman sort of waving, and they were quite clearly Caucasian, you know, and there was a certain kind of gender politics as well about the representation of the man and the woman. So these things are never neutral, and obviously the anthropos, that term, which is it's a Greek philosophical term, and it sort of seems to perform a kind of an abstract humanity. We imagine the anthropos as some abstract human, Vitruvian man, or some kind of something which seems to represent not a specific individual or specific peoples or a specific culture, but an abstract idea of humanity, as in anthropology. And so these things are politically sensitive, and I think it's important to think about them. But on the other hand, I think it's also a real philosophical opportunity to think through the human relationship with the planet, to have this term given to us. We sort of inherit it from the geologists, I nearly said geologians, which is quite a nice term. And I think we can do a lot with the term. And I think one thing it does nicely is that it complicates the position that we stand as subjects in relation to the Earth. I mean, the geological understanding of the Earth is based on the human geologist looking at the objective rocks and so on, and looking at the signs, the fossils, and reconstructing the history of the Earth through that. But when now we're in an age which, on the one hand, we are actively constructing the new Earth, the layers of the Earth, but on the other hand, we are part of what we are seeing in the Earth. You know, we are imagining or finding these new artificial layers of the Earth, made ground of motorways and cities, but also radionuclides of artificial elements and so on. I think that it sort of twists in a very interesting way the sort of epistemology, the way we understand the way that human beings are in the Earth, when we are both the sort of viewer and the viewed, and we're also the spectator, but also the agent. We're looking at our own work. We're imagining the completed work of what we will construct in the Anthropocene layer as we are constructing it. And there's something like a hall of mirrors there, which I think is very, very, very interesting. And I think it's a sort of a great concept to seize and to do some work with in terms of our own agency and our own ability to know what it is that we're doing. Yeah, it's interesting to think about the relationship between the two A's, if you like, Anthropocene and Apocalypse. You know, what is the relationship between the two? I mean, certainly the discourse of the Anthropocene has also been inflected with a sort of tragic dimension of the sort of the famous Ozymandias poem by Shelley. It is by Shelley, isn't it? I think it is. We better check that. The famous Ozymandias poem, you know, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair, which is the inscription at the base of a statue which has been destroyed, and there's just the feet of the statues. There is this great irony that as we achieve, as a species, the status of having a geological epoch named after ourselves, it's because we are putting ourselves in huge danger. We are tipping the Earth, into a state which civilization might not survive. So I think there is the sense of the coming apocalyptic dimension of the Anthropocene, particularly to do with climate change. I think that's the main issue, although the Anthropocene is not just climate change. So there's that apocalyptic dimension, but then there's also other kind of registers, which might be also called messianic, which is a slightly different register of thinking about the end times. And certainly some of the people who talk about the good Anthropocene, particularly in the United States, who talk about the Anthropocene as a calling, if you like, of human beings, that we now recognize our geological force in the Earth, and that potentially we have the ability, the technology to somehow take hold of the Earth and manage and manipulate it. So this sort of idea is a very different notion of apocalypse, which is more to do, well, of course, apocalypse means the uncovered, it's the revelation, that's the original word. It doesn't originally mean a disaster. And I think for some people, the Anthropocene is the revelation of our destiny to be the God species, as Mark Linus puts it, those who can actually steer the planet, who can control evolution, who can control the climate and so on and so forth. So I think there's a different kind of messianism there, which is a sort of post-millennial understanding of how human beings can somehow create a new heaven and a new earth. So I think there are probably a number of different apocalyptic registers going on. And I think it's not an accident that this is happening, because I think that the Anthropocene does something strange to our sense of time. It's very much caught up with the idea of the end of history, particularly after the post-Cold War period. So I think that there is a kind of a readjustment of our sense of the way that history unfolds, and the Anthropocene is part of that, and is pulling in these different possibilities of the ways of how we will relate to the planet in this new future which seems to be unfolding.
Thank you. Now I'll try and be focused.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to think about the political dimensions of the Anthropocene, in particular its relation to what might be called political theology. Certainly there is a moment or a kind of a tendency within the Anthropocene discourse, which some people have drawn attention to, which could be seen as technocratic, as scientistic, about a sort of a depoliticization or post-politicization as scientists seem to take over, that they will tell us what to do and how to guide us through this epoch of great danger to us. And I think there is a certain kind of political theology there, if you like, a sort of to do with the origins of the scientific mode of speaking, and its particular origins in modern thought, in post-Reformation thought. I think there's some interesting entanglements there. But on the other hand, I think also the Anthropocene can also suggest some new ways of thinking about politics in relation to the Earth. I think we need a political geology in a way that there hasn't been before. We have political ecology, we have other kinds of moves within the natural sciences, that have been politicized. We don't yet really have a political geology. Some people are starting to talk about this, including my colleague Nigel Clark at Lancaster. And I think we need to think more about how the politics, which is both in the sense of how we live together, how we live and construct a common world together, but also in the sense of conflict and change and oppression and so on, takes place not just in some abstract space, but a space which is on a planet which has been formed geologically and has, you know, deposits and forces and cycles and structures which are very, very specific. And I think, you know, the Earth has dropped away from too much from social science, and I think it's hard to think politics through in a way that really takes the Earth seriously, but I think it's important to do so, and I think it would be very interesting to think about how many of our political concepts, like revolution, for example, can be seen as cutting across the kind of geophysical and the social divide. So I think there are opportunities for us to think about human beings as a geological force and as a political force, if you like, at the same time, you know, in ways which can compensate for the tendencies towards scientism that is also present in the whole concept of the Anthropocene. So it's interesting to speculate about the future of religion, if you like, in the Anthropocene. You know, if we are moving into the Anthropocene, are we moving away from a time of religion? Was religion a Holocene phenomenon, if you like? It's something that arose with agriculture and dies when, you know, when we move away from an agricultural society, or is something more complex happening? I mean, it's interesting that some of the translations of the Anthropocene as a term are, you know, the age of man or the age of humanity. In some ways that sounds quite 19th century or 18th century, 19th century, post-Enlightenment. It makes one think of Comte and Durkheim, you know, talking about the religion of humanity. So what they were talking about was a sense that, you know, what is becoming sacred is the human being. And that even when religion survives, it's just another way of human beings sort of venerating themselves. And Durkheim had very particular understandings, of course, about what the religion of humanity could be and what its role could be in society and its role in maintaining civilization. So in some ways, the Anthropocene could be seen as a sort of continuation of that sort of sacralization of humanity. But in another way, it's moving obviously in the very opposite direction, because it's bringing humans down back to earth, getting their feet on the ground, making them earthbound, as Bruno Latour puts it. So I think there could be some interesting new mutations, if you like, of the kind of civil religion of humanity. Another interesting thing that I like to think about, it comes actually from some science fiction novels written by Kim Stanley Robinson, known as the Mars trilogy: Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars. And one of the concepts that Robinson uses is the notion of the areophany. So what Robinson is doing is, a lot of the, as humans colonize Mars in the trilogy, a lot of the concepts have to be retooled to make sense in a Martian context on a different planet. So when we would use geo, they use areo after Ares, which is the Greek name for Mars. So the areophany is a kind of a religious apperception of Mars and what it is and what it wants to be, if you like, the spirit of the planet. And some of the characters in Robinson's novels have this experience of the areophany, this revelation, if you like, of Marsness. And I think if we start to take Gaia more seriously and we become much more aware of our planetary being, that we do live on a planet, not just in space and time, but actually on a planet which is in some sense alive and evolving, then perhaps some kind of geophany, some kind of understanding of ourselves as living within a globe, not just on the outside of it, but somehow within a planet, in the sense that Tim Ingold talks about us living within the sphere rather than on the edge of, on the outside of a globe, I think might become part of a new sort of religiosity in the 21st century. I think it already is a kind of geophony. It's not called as such, but certain kind of environmental philosophies and new forms of religiosity have that geophonic quality, and I think it'd be interesting to see how that develops. In terms of the future and the way I see things evolving, I certainly don't place a lot of confidence in the idea that there will be an orderly, technologically driven transition to a new kind of economy, a sort of low-carbon economy, a sustainable economy. I don't see that happening, and I think there are very good reasons why it won't happen, to do not just with vested interests, but locked in technologies, the structure of capitalism, and so on. I think that what I think is important for people to do is, on the one hand, to create more resilient communities in case things go really bad. I think we need to be much more connected to each other locally, to have multiple means of support, not just relying simply on having a wage or a salary and being able to buy things in the shops. I think we need to have more people growing their own food and supporting each other locally as a kind of a safety net, but also because they're good things in themselves as well in terms of quality of life and well-being. I think we need more alternatives. I think we're becoming too monocultural in our society, in our ways of life. I think alternatives and experiments are squeezed out and stamped out too often, and we need that kind of diversity of civilization that we once had in earlier centuries, and we don't have anymore, and that makes us very vulnerable, I think. We need people who know how to live in different ways. We need to be more tolerant of difference because of that, because it makes us stronger for the future. And I also think that there's still a role for the state in at least trying to rein in the power of capital, of private corporations, because clearly the dynamics which are leading us to greater and greater energy use and resource use are partly driven by an economy which is sort of out of control, and I think we need to find ways of sort of unstitching some of that and trying to modulate it, even if we can't replace it. So personally, I try not to think about the future too much because intellectually I don't see a lot of reason for hope. But I suppose humanly, in terms of my children and hope for the world, then one always lives in the hope that alternatives will arise. But at the moment, I must say, I can't quite see where a systemic alternative is going to come from. So I think the most important thing when thinking about the future in a sort of personal, in a real world kind of way, is not to try to predict what's going to happen and to see it sort of unfolding automatically, but thinking about how we as human beings living on this earth can shape the future. And part of that, I think, will involve conflict, will involve recognizing that we shouldn't be naive about the idea that we can all sit round a table, all the different interests that are shaping society and the way it's developing, and come to some common consensual understanding. I think there will be conflicts because there are particular vested interests in keeping the world going in the way it is, and I think it's sometimes important to bring those conflicts out. It's good, I think, sometimes to bring those conflicts out rather than to use overly inclusive language. So ironically, coming back to the Anthropocene, it's a very inclusive language. It sort of imagines that we are all, as one species, a geological agent and that hopefully we as one species can sort of either pull back from turning the planet into an Anthropocenic planet, or somehow become Anthropocene in a responsible way. But I think in some ways we need to unpack that notion of the Anthropos and the Anthropocene, and we have to recognise that the interests of the global north and the global south are very different, and they will have very different narratives about the environmental change we're seeing. And I think that's where the hope lies, in some ways, that we can disaggregate the we and start to more, in a clear-eyed way, understand the different interests that are at play in the world.